All right, so I'm here to talk about our first series of reports from our biennial reports on victimization and victim services in Idaho. And I have my little stopwatch here so I don't go over, because honestly, I could talk a half an hour, 25 minutes on each one of these because it's data and you know me. So I want to keep myself on track. I do have, we've got 4 reports that are out. And so I'm just going to kind of give a brief overview of all of them. And it's almost all visual. I've included our all of our infographics, so it's really easy to access the findings. But you can get all of our full reports on the Department of Criminal Justice website. Although we will be launching in the next probably 2 weeks, we'll be launching a website off of our Department of Criminal Justice website that will be a website for the biennial reports, and will serve as, our hope is, a clearinghouse for as much of the information on victimization in the state as we can possibly gather. So everything we've gathered in the last 18 months will be on that website, and then we'll be updating it. What we're trying to do is, when we find information on other agencies' websites, we're just trying to link to those websites so we can get some traffic to those agency websites as well. But try to present one central place that people can start at if they're looking for information on victimizations. And we're also partnering with SAC, and they're creating a series of dashboards for us that we'll be able to have on each of our websites. So hopefully next month or in March, I'll be able to just give you a brief tour of those websites. The Biennial Report Series is a joint venture between the Department of Criminal Justice here at Boise State and the Idaho Council on Domestic Violence and Victim Assistance, and is funded through their VOCA funds. The contract period is from 2019 to 2023. So we'll do 2 series of at least 4 reports. We will likely be putting out additional reports, and I'll talk for a minute about a couple of reports that I think are probably going to come out, even though it's an off year for us, are going to come out in the next year. So we do 2 series of at least 4 reports. One that is a survey of victim services agency. One that is a survey of crime victims, one that is assessing the series of legislation that was passed by the legislature on sexual assault kit testing. And then we have our kind of our open issue on emerging issues in victimization and victim services. And that led us to the first report that came out in August. I've already presented at the commission about that report, but I did include it here so that all of the information would be in one PowerPoint presentation on all of the reports. So we did release that in August. And this little infographic here talks about some of the impacts that we found. Primarily that response was dependent upon where people lived in Idaho. At the time that we did the study, which would be about a year ago, there was no real consistent response provided because it really depended on resources available to policing agencies and victim services agencies that varied by department. When you see the little green flags throughout the infographics, those are things that we are going to keep our eye on, that we want to look at, make sure that we're looking at the trends in that. So for here, one of the impacts was that victim service agencies were reporting difficulties in gaining access to victims to offer services. Part of that's due to safety concerns because offenders were often still present. And may be aware that the victim is seeking services and could then be placing them in greater danger. And so that's really presenting a difficult barrier for agencies to get around. And then also that victim service agencies were reporting some concern that because victims have begun to notice the differences in response in policing agencies because of Clark, from their contact pre-Clark and then their contact post-Clark, that victims were beginning to express some frustration and disappointment with what they were expecting policing agencies to do. And so victim services agencies told us that they were concerned that victims could become frustrated to the point of potentially not contacting any longer. And so these are some of the numbers that we gathered from our study. And just a reminder that the Clark study was a focus group. We held 22 focus groups around the state. We met with roughly 30 different agencies in those focus groups and 90 criminal justice professionals. And so a couple of things just to point out that roughly 41% of the policing agencies reported a perceived increase in the use of citations in response to misdemeanor domestic violence. Over half reported an immediate worry about how to respond to DV calls, that when the decision came out, over half of them were really concerned about not understanding how they were going to respond to DV calls coming in. And 36% reported a perceived increase in felony arrests. When we talked with victim services agencies, almost 90% reported difficulty in contacting or accessing victims, as I reported. So that was a really high number. That impact is significant on victim service agencies trying to be able to get services to victims when the offender is still in the home. We made a number of recommendations from that report. The ones where you see the little lightning bolts are just I think when I went through and put this together, the ones that I really wanted people to take a look at if they were interested in what we thought could happen based on the data to improve the situation. The first two obviously are investing in an expansion of both community-based services and victim witness units. And then the next one with a little bullet point there is investing in basic victim services training twice a year, held at different locations across the state. What we heard from victim services was that they have turnover, quite a bit of turnover, and there had not been with the Victim Assistance Academy, the Idaho Victim Assistance Academy going dark for the last 4 years. There was really no central training they could send victim service providers to when they hired them for the initial basic training or for additional training, because there used to be an advanced academy as well as a team academy. And that Idaho Victim Assistance Academy not only served victim service providers, but as you'll see in a few minutes, it also served as a venue for new prosecutors, new police officers, officers who were moving from patrol to investigations, for probation officers and for nurses to also receive ongoing training and education on victimization, how to work with victim services, specific forms of victimization, and number 7 there, the use of on-scene assessment tools that provide information on the level of dangerousness and or lethality. For example, here in Idaho, the Idaho Risk Assessment of Dangerousness. With the loss of that, what we heard was that there was not any central location. And so each individual agency is having to try and create their own, and they may only have one new person, but they've got to run a 40-hour training for that one person. And so we heard that across the state from the various agencies that we spoke with. You also see the mandating telephonics, electronic warrants availability across the state. I've been invited to a couple of Zoom meetings since the Clark study where I have seen or heard judges talking about the increased availability that they're trying to do in terms of both telephonic and electronic warrants. And then that we proposed using that same system for emergency civil protection orders, so that if officers cannot effect an arrest on the scene for various reasons that can't happen, including, I think people forget that part of the problem with warrant availability is staffing and call volumes at policing agencies. That varies. It varies by shift. It varies by day. And depending on what the calls are coming in at that time, they may not have enough people on the road in order to stay and do that warrant, that electronic warrant. As in some locations, it was taking as long as an hour and a half to get that warrant done. And if it's a DV, you're probably tying up 3 officers with 2 officers on the scene because you don't want to leave 1 officer with the suspect for safety reasons, and then a 3rd officer trying to do the warrant. But we thought that that was a really innovative way, especially given what we had seen in COVID, and the courts adapting and being flexible in terms of issuing civil protection orders, and that somehow those 2 things could be melded together. And so you can go through and see the rest of those bullet points, investing in training for police professionals in victimization, and also making sure that officers are actually directly connecting victims on the scene with victim services, which could help overcome some of those barriers. So our team also did a crime victim service provider survey, and Dr. Laura King on our team led that effort. And so she conducted an online survey of victim service providers across the state. You can see that we asked recipients of VOCA funding, agencies that are a member of the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, as well as victim witness programs across the state to complete the survey. We're going to keep an eye on that survey response rate of 35%. For online surveys, that's not bad, but we would certainly like to see that increase. One of my concerns is that we have both if we're looking at any of our criminal justice agencies, we are a small enough state that I'm concerned about professionals being overwhelmed by surveys. And so I think that we need to start thinking about even doing an annual criminal justice victimization survey so that agencies around the state who want to learn information, we can have one survey. We could do it so that people are only answering questions that are appropriate for them, but to stop kind of hitting people all the time on surveys, because that's going to hurt all of us in the attempt to try and get data. This is the distribution of victim service providers who responded to our survey. We were able to map them out, and that's something else that we're going to keep an eye on. As the response rate increases, how does that distribution change? You can see that the metro area was very overrepresented. 81% of participating agencies were located in the metro area. But a couple of things I want to point out here. 64% of the people or the agencies who responded reported serving 1 to 2 counties. So most of these agencies aren't just serving a single like city or town. They're serving an entire county and sometimes multiple counties. We had 10 counties in the state that are served by only 3 agencies. And those 3 agencies are also agencies that serve the entire state. They are statewide agencies. And then 58% of the agencies that were participating serve 1 or more non-metro areas. So their primary base is generally in a metro area, and then they're also trying to do outreach to a rural area, which can present numerous problems, but also one of those is maybe not really understanding the culture, the resources, and have those stakeholder connections in those rural counties because that's not where they're based. And so here, a number of, we asked people, our agencies, what was the crime that they most frequently served. And so you can see that here overwhelmingly 66% reported serving victims of domestic violence most frequently, with only 9% reporting serving stalking more frequently. You can see that as the frequency of reported crimes that we see get smaller, so do the numbers in terms of agencies most frequently serving them. And then we asked them to report the vulnerable or underserved populations that they generally work with. You can see those here listed in order. Children are the most frequent underrepresented or vulnerable populations served. That's at number 1, with non-English people at number 5, and people from the LGBTQ community at number 8. 3 things that we're going to keep an eye on here. We asked agencies what they believed were the most needed services for victims: housing and shelter, emergency services like food and clothing, and individual counseling. 42% of agencies reported 3 or more barriers to being able to provide services to victims. And in our needs assessment that we did in 2015, that was the threshold for us to identify high need areas or high need agencies. And so 42% of the agencies we surveyed fell into that high need category. You can see there the most impactful barriers that they reported: funding restrictions. So the federal funds that come in that overwhelmingly fund the victim services across the state have restrictions on them that do not allow a lot of flexibility to meet needs of victims that may not be covered. For example, if they can't go to individual counseling without childcare, but they have no supportive family in the area to provide childcare, you can't use WILCA funds to pay those childcare costs. Also, at the bottom there, you can see that community-based agencies and agencies that are located in or serving rural agencies or non-metro agencies were significantly more likely to fall into that high need agency category. And then we do have a number of recommendations that we made coming from the service provider survey. And you can see those there with the lightning bolts. Provide state appropriated funding for crime victim services in Idaho, which would hopefully allow them to cover those costs that VOCA, or those services that VOCA money won't cover. So offering more flexibility in meeting the needs of victims. Training again, but that training needs to be in a variety of modes, both in person and online opportunities and across the state, as opposed to requiring people to come to Ada County or to Boise to get that training. And so I'm getting down on time, so I'm going to hop through these. So then the one we released just this month was our first look at the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. And we looked specifically at the very first legislation that was passed, HB 528, the first effort to mandate the testing of all sexual assault kits. And you can see here that we worked with the crime lab, and we took a random sample of kits that were submitted to the lab. We took a random sample of kits from the year before HB 528, a random sample from the year after HB 528. Then we reached out to policing agencies. We had 23 out of the 100 policing agencies who submitted SACs during those 2 time periods were randomly selected and participated in the survey. We asked them to provide us with the police reports associated with those sexual assault kits. And then we also asked them to provide us a case in a similar crime category that did not include a sexual assault kit that happened during that same time frame, that pre or post, which allowed us to have a control group to look at to see if cases with SACs looked or were handled differently than cases without SACs. We also did a survey of policing professionals who were involved in the cases that were in our sample. And so we surveyed them on their general perspectives about sexual violence cases and investigations. as well as just some demographic information, but without including any individual identifiers for them. We also did offer them an opportunity to complete an optional wellness survey. And so we, most of them did that, and we will be sharing those results with those officers. And I think that's going to be, as an aggregate, we'll be able to talk about it. And that's something that will be interesting as well. So what did we find? We found that 62% of victims are assaulted by friends or acquaintances. That's the largest category. That's in line with what we see nationally and in other research studies. Most people are victimized by somebody they know, and primarily by a friend or an acquaintance, with intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or sexual assault occurring roughly in about 20% of cases. Over half of cases involve delayed reporting. We know that there are a number of reasons why victims hesitate to report, may wait 24 hours, may wait a couple of days after they talk to a friend, or they talk to a counselor, or they think about whether they want to interact with the criminal justice system. So we'll be keeping an eye on that as we do the next round of SACI studies in 2022. Also, when we analyzed those police reports, what we found is that roughly 32% of officers connect victims of sexual violence to victim services at the initial response, meaning they handed them something or they provided them with some information on how to contact a community-based program or a victim witness, or they called a victim witness coordinator to meet them. In fact, 23% offered to contact an advocate or victim witness coordinator for the victim, and 36% referred the victim to those services. A couple of other things that we're watching here, 73% of victims cooperated throughout the investigation. I think that is higher than what people anticipate, with 98% of victims cooperating at the scene. So that does decrease the longer the investigation goes on. There was no significant difference on any response characteristics between cases before HB 528 and cases after HB 528. I have to move you guys over here. And then the outcomes that we're looking at, these are outcomes that we'll track in the upcoming follow-up studies. Cases where officers noted victim credibility issues were connected to shorter disposition times and had fewer arrests as case clearances than cases without officers noting victim credibility issues. So 32% of cases where officers noted victim credibility issues, and we define victim credibility issues as a number of things, but victims reporting having gaps in memory, victims having some inconsistencies in their statements, officers stating in reports that victims had prior alcohol or drug histories, or had previously consented to sex with the suspect. And while we know that those things may be of interest moving forward in a case, they can also indicate potential adherence to rape myths. And we have probably 15 years of research or more on that now, demonstrating that connection. The average time to case clearance was 44 days. Cases before HB 528 took significantly longer to clear than after HB 528, so that is one significant difference. But having a sexual assault kit in a sexual assault case did not have a statistically significant effect on case clearance. And that was in line with our hypothesis moving in, that a sexual assault kit is not the end all be all in whether a case moves forward, especially given that we have such a high percentage of victims who know the suspects in the case, that sometimes the issue is not whether or not sex occurred, but whether it's consent. And a sexual assault kit obviously does not measure consent. However, I think this is where the policing professional survey is really interesting and important, because 72% of policing professionals support test all. And the reason they support test all at such a high proportion is that over half of them report that that SAC evidence is very important in their investigations. And primarily the reason why it's important is what they told us in some open-ended questions was that they use any evidence they can get from the SAC to corroborate the victim's statement. And they see the SAC as one of the primary means in crimes where there aren't often lots of witnesses to be able to say, we have physical evidence that supports what the victim's saying. And that may be documentation of injuries, vaginal injuries or other injuries to genitalia or injuries on the body, or DNA evidence that will work to corroborate the victim's statement. And that's why they believe that SAC is so important. We also asked them, because of that, that outcome of victim credibility, what factors they used to determine victim credibility. And so we flagged that because we would like to come back and ask officers when we draw the next sample, which will be more recent cases, and will likely involve other officers, different officers, to ask them the same question so we can see how these things change or if they change. But they rely on multiple things: victim statements, the ability to corroborate the victim statement, whether or not the victim cooperates for them is a measure of credibility, which could be problematic, as victims can elect not to cooperate for a vast number of reasons that have nothing to do with whether the case is valid or not. And then a few indicated that they look at the prior history of the victim and or suspect. We did have a handful of officers, I would say probably 5 to 6 officers, who when we asked this question, which was an open-ended question, said it was not their job to evaluate victim credibility. Their job was just to gather the facts of the case. And it was the prosecutor and the court, and ultimately a jury's decision to evaluate the credibility of a victim. And so we have a number of recommendations coming out of that study. 2 of them are to modify 396316, which is the statute that requires that officers provide victims with information on domestic violence. And given how important victim services is for victims of sexual violence as well, we recommend that that is an opportunity to send a message and to increase, hopefully, the connection of victims to victim services at the scene by policing professionals. And then also to look at that same statute in terms of modifying it to actually require policing agencies to put victims in touch with available services, victim witness or community-based victim services. And in areas where that is, where they don't have victim witness or community-based agencies that are available to them, there are hotlines that officers could put victims in touch with, so that they at least get that initial connection to someone that they can go back to and speak with. And then I'll come back to that one in just a second. So finally, and I'm going to do it quick because I know that my best efforts always fail in keeping on time here, but we did conduct, or we are, I should say.
Dr. Bostaph, you do have 15 minutes. So.
Oh, I do?
You do. We're a little ahead of time, so.
You should never have told me that.
Make that 10 minutes.
Okay. We are in the process of conducting a crime victim survey right now. We released a very preliminary report on that. And what we did was we created an online survey. I am a little proud because we created that survey in 5 different languages. including English, Spanish, French, Arabic, and Swahili, after talking and surveying agencies and asking what the most frequent languages they come in contact with outside of English. We were able to get translations done for those surveys online. And we're working with the 100 plus victim service providers around the state who receive VOCA funds. The council, because they are the VOCA money provider, has mandated that as part of funding, they have to hand out the survey to every victim they have contact with. Obviously, that doesn't mean all the victims are going to complete those surveys, as you will see in a minute. We do have 97 total submitted responses, but they're not completed responses. And so for this, we have a very, very small sample size of only 19 responses that we were able to complete for analysis. So we really have to keep our eye on that. But this is an ongoing survey through 2023. So we will be doing periodic updates on it. And so obviously some of the things we'll be watching. We currently have all female respondents. We obviously would like to see that change to get some victims who are male as well. We are watching the race and ethnicity numbers as well, and also crime types. Right now, it's heavy on domestic violence and child sexual abuse and stalking. So we would like to see a broader, this is not just a survey of victims of IPV or victims of sexual violence. This is a survey for all victims of crime. And so we'd like to see that expand as well. We do have some variation in sexual orientation in our sample, and we do have a variety of victim to perpetrator relationships, although you can see it's heavily weighted towards intimate partners and relatives. So these preliminary responses, once again, all of them flagged because we want to just keep an eye on them. But 67% of victims who took the survey, completed the survey, said that they reported to the police. Now, that is, it's so preliminary. I don't want to put a lot of stock in it, but we asked that question because we have no other data point in the state for what proportion of crime is actually being reported to policing agencies. And if we're looking at judging how we are making inroads in reaching community members and trying to get them to engage with the criminal justice system, to entrust the criminal justice system, we need to know and keep track of that number of how frequently crime is being reported. And so it's so preliminary, but we don't have any other right now data point for that. So right now what we see is the top reasons for people not reporting is that they didn't want to get the offender into trouble. We generally would see this among domestic violence or intimate partner sexual violence. Also afraid of the offenders was one of the other reasons. And then the third top reason for not reporting was no confidence in the criminal justice system. When we ask would you report to the police if you were harmed again, 61% said yes. And I think that that's likely heavily weighted by the domestic violence victims in the survey, and that at the point in time when an assault is happening, really the only option they have is to call policing agencies because they know policing agencies can get there and intervene and stop the violence. And that harkens back to why the effects of Clark are so important for us to keep track of. And then you can see the services most frequently used that victims reported using: emergency services and individual counseling and crisis response. The most helpful services, most of the time they named a specific agency, the agency they had contact with, and said they were most helpful. It wasn't any one thing that they did. But then you can see that counseling again comes up as the most helpful service. We see that both in this victim service survey or crime victims survey, and we see it also in the victim service provider survey. And I think that that's really instructive, especially for the work that the BHC is doing moving forward. And then you can see least helpful services on the other side, which we will also be tracking. We then ask them about options, their opinions about their interaction with service providers. And you can see that overwhelmingly people felt that they were treated with respect by victim services, by counseling services, by policing agencies, and by prosecutors' offices. And then we asked them if they felt that their needs were met. And you can see that we only have, the numbers are really small, but that it really was with prosecutor offices that this preliminary result said that they didn't believe their needs were met. Now, I think what's really instructive here is that we don't know what they think, that what needs they're looking to the prosecutor's office to meet. And I think that is a question that if we had the ability to do a longer survey, that we could gather some of that data. And I think that whole piece right here about opinions is something that will likely lead us to maybe start doing some focus groups. Surveys are not the best means to get this kind of information, but maybe doing some focus groups with victims around the state allows us the opportunity to get a little better understanding of whether and what they think those needs are that aren't being met, and whether that meshes with whether the prosecutor's office is actually the office that they should be looking to get those needs met. And then at the bottom there, we asked them if they were aware of their rights, both statutory and constitutional in Idaho, and then how many of them reported being able to exercise those rights. And so you can see 53% reported being aware of their rights, and 25% reported being able to exercise their rights. And so we do have a number of recommendations. One, obviously, since this is a preliminary survey and we're just starting the process of gathering this data, we are really pushing agencies to continue sharing the survey with victims. We've actually created business cards, and there's a QR code on the back, as well as a link on the back. And so agencies can just hand the card out to victims. They're not handing an actual survey. And the survey is adapted for mobile use as well. So they can just do it on their phones, and they can use the QR code to connect right to it, or they can use the type in the link that's on the card. And then the one I'm going to focus on just for briefly, because it appears in multiple recommendations, is this need for a statewide victimization survey in Idaho that really borrows heavily from the methods, the research design that the National Crime Victimization uses, which has been done since 1969. It is well tested, it's rigorous, it has a lot of scientific validity to it, but we can't get any local data from the National Crime Victimization Survey because the numbers of people that they survey in Idaho are so low that the data is unstable. I would say it's not valid. And so the only way we're going to really know the true level of victimization, of all forms of victimization in Idaho, is to replicate that study for our state, which then provides us a baseline to then see if we are making inroads in various crime areas for victims to increase reporting to the criminal justice system. We do have some ongoing projects. We are also working on the Missing and Murdered Indigenous People project with the funds that the legislature provided last year. We are hoping we will have a report out on that MMIP project in October. We are going to continue with Clark and start looking at call volumes and calls for service data from pre-Clark and post-Clark. I wouldn't expect to see a report from us on that until early 2022. We are also going to produce a report on similar to what we did policing agencies on HB 528 and SACS, but looking at court data. And that will be early 2022. And then we do have a new venture with the state, with the Council on People with Disabilities, and we'll be beginning a 3-year project with another series of reports looking specifically at the victimization of people with disabilities in the state.